Okay, well, we will move on, and let's take this first question. Caller, welcome show. Please tell us your name, where you're calling from.
Hey, William. This is Holly from Mississippi. I have, for the longest time, wondered about Paul. I have a big issue with him, and he was mainly the reason that I started pulling away from Christianity. A question that I've never had anyone be able to really answer is how in the world did he become an apostle when he did not meet the New Testament criteria for an apostle? And Matthias had already been selected to replace Judas. So that would make him a 13th apostle, since there were 12 to supposedly represent the 12 tribes. So I'm just wondering why anyone even thought he was credible to begin with based on that. Thank you so much. Bye.
So as it turns out, Paul was the most important convert to Christianity. It would not be difficult to see how Paul would be given this title as an apostle. An apostle simply means, it's a Greek word, which means someone who is sent on a message. But you're right, in the Gospels, we're told about the 12, and not only told about them, we're actually given a list of who the 12 are. Bear in mind how significant Paul is to the church that emerged, that we can witness to this day. Paul, we are told, authored 13 of the 27 books in the Christian Bible. 7 of them really come from the hand of Paul. The other 6, not likely. But whoever wrote it wanted the reader to believe that those letters were written by the hand of Paul. You have another letter that was widely believed to be written by Paul. That's how it made it into the Christian Bible. That's, of course, the book of Hebrews, but it's written anonymously. And you have the book of Acts. This is astounding. The book of Acts, which is called the Acts of the Apostles, but it really should be renamed as the Acts of Paul, because it's very much there to advance the idea that Paul was chief among apostles. He was preeminent, and in fact, his ideas were the ones that was superior to others, and everyone fell into place. And therefore, the end of the book of Acts, once Peter leaves the stage, it's really all about Paul. We have one book in the Christian Bible that was written almost certainly to oppose Paul, and that's the book of James. So Paul looms huge. And the reason why you have so much in the Christian Bible lifting up Paul to that height is because Paul was an enormously controversial figure during the first century. We don't have to guess that. And I'm not saying that because of my personal view of Paul. In fact, almost all of his writings are there to show why his view of Christianity, his Christology is correct, and the Christology of other early Christians were not correct. His opponents, his interlocutors, at virtually every turn were fellow Christians. Now, just a point about that term Christian, it's possible that the early Christians did not refer to themselves as Christians. We don't know. From the New Testament's use of the term Christian, it would appear that was a term that non-Christians used about Christians, and then later, of course, subsequently, Christians adopted that name. It's possible. That's a very reasonable possibility. There's many examples of all sorts of Christian denominations that adopted the names of those who didn't agree with them. Methodists, as an example, Quakers, and others. So your question really goes to the fact that we have the 12 that are assigned in the Gospels, the 12 apostles, and Judas commits suicide in 2 different ways, but he's pulled out. Matthias is brought in instead, and that's early on in the book of Acts. And then how did Paul get in there on the team? So as it turns out, the term apostle is used in the Christian Bible could refer to the 12, and that would be, but it's also the term which just means somebody who's been sent does gain a more elastic meaning or a broader meaning to any person who has seen Jesus, has a message directly from Jesus, and therefore in addition to the 12. In fact, although Paul calls himself an apostle frequently, and not just any apostle, but a top apostle, how do you know it's true? He admits it himself. But Paul does refer to the 12 as being separate and unique, and for example, in 1 Corinthians 15. So Paul's reference to himself as an apostle, Galatians 1, 1 Corinthians, it's everywhere. He is referring to himself as having a unique revelation from Jesus. And not only that, he holds himself, in a sense, to be of the highest order of apostle, because what he has is directly from Jesus, according to Paul, and he didn't get it from anyone in Jerusalem. He doesn't need anybody in Jerusalem. He didn't need anyone else. He's superior to them in his revelation. And look, Paul was a very big fan of himself. All right, so that sounds like a biting remark about him, and it is. So Paul, you're familiar with Galatians 1, Philippians 3. Paul is really promoting himself as the person who has the authority. And moreover, he is at the very same time demeaning others who would have that same, who would be called an apostle. For example, he would, in the same context, in Galatians 1 and 2, he would want to point out that Peter was somewhat of a hypocrite, and Paul was not slow to say that to his face. That's right there in Galatians 2. The reason for all this is that Paul was fighting with other Christians in the direction of where Christianity should go. There were many people who thought it was necessary to keep the Torah, even if you were a Christian. How does believing in Jesus have anything to do with following the Torah? And moreover, you have in the Sermon on the Mount, we are told that Jesus says that he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. And in fact, anybody who changes the smallest part of the Torah, a jot or a tittle, a line or a dot, would be considered least in the kingdom of heaven. Unless your righteousness exceeded that of the Pharisees and scribes, you would. So we see that clearly in the Sermon on the Mount. But Paul's theology was entirely different. He believed that the law has been made a curse for us. He believed that God was done with the Torah, keeping the law. You can see how Paul's idea won out, and that you don't have to keep the Shabbos anymore. He's done with the Sabbaths and new moons, and all these commandments are all done with, and circumcision. That's how Galatians really ends. He mocks people who insist on being circumcised, and he says, why don't you just cut the whole thing off in Galatians 5:12, which is a very, I know you're listening to that and going, really? Well, yeah, that's exactly what he says. He says, if you're so committed to circumcision, why don't you just essentially castrate yourself? You have to believe, you're a Christian, that God actually said that. You have to believe that circumcision, a right given to Avram Avinu, Abraham our father, and to his descendants, in Genesis 17, you have to believe that same God is telling Paul to say, why don't you cut the whole thing off? That's what you have to say. Another thing about Paul, he didn't get along with other people very well. I'm not saying this because I don't regard him in high esteem. Well, how do I know? Well, it says so in the Christian Bible. How do you trust what it says in the Christian Bible? You're not a Christian. Why don't you believe? Because it's so embarrassing. It's inconceivable that would have been made up. It's inconceivable that Paul's unwillingness to travel with John Mark, he just wouldn't, his conflict with Peter, it's inconceivable that everybody got along just great. And then they just made up that Paul was fighting with these people. That's pretty much the most rigorous criteria you can apply to studying ancient documents and try to tease out what is authentic and what is invented. So Paul refers to himself as an apostle, and that, in fact, his zeal for the law exceeded those of everyone around him. And Paul won. Paul's view was successful. The Greek influence which he injected into this young Christian religion, their worldview about commandments, about the dualism of the body and the soul, that bleeds all over Paul's writings. All of these ideas that were well ensconced in the Greco-Roman mind, he infused into the church. There were other Christians, as I mentioned, who did not share this view, in fact, detested Paul, despised him. In a sense, it's understandable why Paul would be such a blistering individual, because he was fighting all of his life. The answer to your question is that, yes, it's true that there are the 12 that are the apostles. Again, so that word means sent on a mission. We even have an instance in the book of Hebrews with Jesus, who would have been an apostle of God as well. So the word apostle does have some elasticity in the Christian Bible, and Paul insists that he is one, and he is not the least of them. So thank you very much for your question.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא